Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. In an effort to keep this show going and one day be supported without ads, I'd like to invite everyone listening to become a supporting listener on Patreon. For as low as just $1 a month, you can enjoy listening to various standalone series, as well as complimentary series that seek to fill in the gaps with information that didn't quite make it into the public show. If you support what's happening here and want to learn more, please head over to Patreon and become a supporting listener. The link is in the show notes of this episode. Now, on this episode, we certainly pushed the narrative along, but to be honest, I needed to take a breath and appreciate Rome, which is the primary setting in this one. We say these place names, but do we actually stop and appreciate these places and take a moment to understand their historical depths? Well, as I hope I've made abundantly clear on this podcast, I began this show in an effort to fully understand my Western context, blessings and blemishes alike. That includes the historical context of my Western context, which began long before the events outlined in each of these episodes. American listeners often find it rather difficult to appreciate history's full depth, as our nation's history, our unique culture's history, really only goes a few centuries back. But 1,000 years ago, that's difficult to grasp for many of us. There's a great one-liner in the American sitcom Parks and Rec in which one of the stereotypical American characters is standing in the middle of London, and he says to the protagonist of the show, "History began in 1776. Everything before that was a mistake." Hilarious, I admit. Cracks me up every time I think about it. But I admit that it's hardly true. I want to learn more about life 1,000 years ago, as it feeds my understanding of where I stand today. But here's one better. 1,000 years ago, those people also had 1,000-year-old context. And not just 1,000 years, but they had thousands of years to walk amongst. On this episode, we will delve into one building's 1,000-year-old context, which stretches back another 1,000 years almost. This building's story includes Roman emperors, visions of archangels, gifts from Constantine the Great, and the final resting place for a number of historically significant figures. Not to mention the fact that it stands as the primary setting of what's happening late in the year 1083. This is episode 141, entitled Castel Sant'Angelo. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Sometime in midwinter of 1083, Rome was just beginning to breathe again. They were fixing up the walls, reestablishing some structural peace throughout the city, and were beginning to look hopefully at the impending spring pop up with warmth and growth. Pope Gregory VII was back in charge of the church, and the Roman elite were shaking off their recent affair with King Henry IV of Germany and his hand-picked pontiff, Antipope Clement III. They were looking forward to some good old-fashioned peace and prosperity, though to the medieval mind, that came with a massive caveat. Who knew when someone in the European nobility would throw a hissy fit and raise another army? And that's exactly what happened in midwinter, early in 1083. King Henry IV reemerged from beyond the city of Seven Hills, and the army that accompanied him was the largest army the Romans had seen in quite some time, certainly larger than any Henry had ever graced them with. Pope Gregory VII hunkered down for yet another fight against his lifelong enemy. But something unexpected, but if you ask me entirely unsurprising, occurred. Beaten down and demoralized, the Romans en masse didn't even pick up their arms to engage. The German siege was immediately put into place, and it was up to the city's sparse defensive forces to man the towers and walls and roads in and out of the Eternal City. Over the ensuing 3 or 4 months, Henry sent agent after agent secretly into the city to distribute money and gifts to various Roman elite. This, as you can imagine, gradually wore down any defensive structures in place. On June 2nd, 1083, a contingent of Lombards from Milan and Saxons from a conquered England, they scaled the city walls, killed the defenders, and took control of a tower. It took no more than 2 hours for Henry to flood the city after that. Henry's army scattered once inside, and the usual evil took place, but Henry was able to maintain a good measure of order, enough to navigate the entanglements and engagements all the way back to St. Peter's Basilica. The fighting, that is, came right up to Pope Gregory VII's doorstep, but when they arrived, they found no pope. Gregory knew about the corruption within the city and of Henry's agents, and he had made plans to flee when the inevitable happened. One saving grace was that only parts of Rome were compromised, leaving the majority of Rome still within Gregory's control. It's a strange dynamic, a city split, but Rome's neighborhoods were run by prominent families with their own defenders. This dynamic might have been the thing that allowed Gregory several more months outside of the control of Henry. However, it was still an incredibly dangerous position he and his loyal Roman friends were in. Before Henry got too close, Gregory was able to make it to the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he would wage a personal siege right there within the city of Rome itself. Now, the Castel Sant'Angelo has appeared on the podcast before, but we haven't gotten a full sense of this place quite yet. I thought we could take some time right now to do so. Many centuries earlier, back in the days of pre-Christian Rome, between the years of 96 and 180 AD, there were what we know today as the 5 good emperors in imperial Roman history. These were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and, of Stoic philosophy fame, Marcus Aurelius. During this time, Rome engaged in wars with the Germanic tribes in the north, battled plagues, of which the Aurelian plague under Marcus Aurelius is considered one of the worst in history, and extended the far reaches of the empire up into Lower Scotland. Just think Trajan's Wall and Hadrian's Wall beyond it. But it was also a time of intense civic pride within the Roman sphere, a flourishing of philosophy and art, and economic prosperity harkening back to some of its finest years enjoyed by their ancestors. The 84 years of the reigns of the 5 good emperors were a good time to be alive, all things considered, under Roman imperial rule. It was also a time of massive building projects as well. As for the roads, Rome already linked its capital to the southeast with the Via Appia, or the Appian Way in English, which linked Rome to Brindisi. But what the Via Appia did was stay to the west of the spinal mountain range called the Apennines, until the Apennines just fizzled out near the bottom of the boot. At that point, the Via Appia cut across the southern Apennine foothills toward Taranto and then on to Brindisi. What Emperor Trajan did was cut across the Apennines much farther north in order to connect much more directly the growing ports and cities on the Adriatic side of the Italian peninsula. Following the Appian Way down to Benevento, the new Via Traian, or Trajan Way, it cuts up and over the Apennines over to the town of Troia, and from Troia it turns south toward Brindisi. However, it ends up cutting right through the port of Bari. You see how these things grew over the centuries. Roads Well, they need bridges. And it was during this time that those famous arch bridges burst in great number across the breadth of the empire. Now, to be sure, those arch bridges were in use for centuries already, but there was an explosion of them from the massive to the stream crossing size during the reign of the 5 emperors. I bring this up because these same roads and bridges not only created what our 11th century characters in our story lived in and fought for, but they were also still very much in use during the 11th century. For instance, the Alcántar Bridge was built during this time in modern-day Spain. It sits along the Via de la Plata, an ancient Roman road that travels from Seville in the south to Astoria in the far north, where it hits the world-famous pilgrimage route El Camino de Santiago. This bridge was absolutely necessary for merchants and pilgrims and militaries to travel across the Tagus River, which almost bisects the Iberian Peninsula. For the record, as a testament to Roman engineering, the Alcantara Bridge still stands today. A side note to this side note about Rome's 5 good emperors, one may make the case that all of this may seem entirely superfluous to what's going on in our 11th century story, but I disagree. If anything, it shows that the world that this story is unfolding is a deeply ancient world, something my American listeners, if they're honest with themselves, would naturally find very difficult to fully grasp. The old world, Europe, is a world built upon a world built upon a world built upon a world, and on and on. I find that understanding more about who and what came before the likes of Gregory VII, Henry IV, Matilda of Canossa, Robert Guiscard, are entirely relevant to their story, as it's an extension of the whole story. All right, so back to it. In Rome itself, a number of arches and monuments also popped up during the reign of the 5 good emperors. Temples, such as the Temple of Venus and Roma, dedicated to the goddesses Venus Felix and Roma Eterna, were built. An interesting note about this exemplar temple is that today, the Temple of Venus and Roma, once one of the largest temples in all of Rome, is now a pile of rubble and standalone columns. Well, not all of it. See, during the 600s AD, the Western Apse was first converted into a Christian church. And this portion of the temple was first consecrated as the Church of Santa Maria Nova, before later becoming the Church of Francesca Romana in honor of the Roman Saint Francis, which can still be attended today, if you can believe it. Yes, they hold Mass there as well. In addition, the Pantheon itself was actually rebuilt during Hadrian's rule in the year 126 AD. And what we see today of the Pantheon is what's left of this refurbishment, meaning it was 1,000 years newer during the 11th century. Now, narrowing our focus on the Castel Sant'Angelo, Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian, in the year 139 AD, finished a 4-year construction project that cost boatloads of imperial pennies. It was to stand as his family's and imperial successors' mausoleum. Well, Hadrian didn't quite see the final product. He died in 138, just 1 year shy of its completion. Still, he and his family were in fact interred there, as well as subsequent emperors, including the peaceful Antoninus Pius, the stoic Marcus Aurelius, the psychopathic Commodus, the pragmatic reformer Septimius Severus, and the absolute tyrant Caracalla. It was with Caracalla that Hadrian's mausoleum stopped being the resting ground for Roman emperors and their families. The structure itself is just simply magnificent, truth be told. Its design was based on Emperor Augustus's own mausoleum, only Hadrian sought to make his far grander and ornate. Essentially, it's a massive cylindrical structure set within a perfectly square outer wall. The wall spans a perimeter of 1,152 feet, that is 351 meters, making each wall about 288 feet long, or about 88 meters. And that's nearly the length of a football field, from end zone to end zone on each of its 4 sides. The height of the wall is upwards of 50 feet tall, or 15 meters. As far as mausoleums go, this one's pretty impressive. It should be noted that much of the original stone is still in place, though from time to time portions had to be updated, replaced, and fixed. Now, the main structure inside is what's called a cylindrical drum. The drum has a circumference of 210 feet, or 64 meters, which fills almost the entire outer wall's inner space. The drum also shoots far higher into the sky than the wall does, making it an imposing structure in and of itself. The wall is one thing, but the cylindrical stone structure in the center makes it far less of a resting place and more so a defensive structure, at least in appearance. The height of the drum in the middle, well, it was originally 157 feet, or 48 meters. The height included a giant statue of Emperor Hadrian himself, which was located in the very center of the drum at the top. If one walked from the Vatican today, it's nothing more than a, say, 10-minute walk from doorstep to doorstep, and it's a straight shot between the two as well. If one were to stand at the gates of entry to Castel Sant'Angelo and look west, one would see a perfectly straight pedestrian roadway leading right through the center of the Vatican's giant forum, complete with the obelisk jutting out from its center. From where one is standing, one could turn toward the southeast, and one would see the massive Pantheon just a 15-minute walk away from the Tiber River and through the Roman neighborhoods there. See, if you see further in that same direction, another 30-minute walk beyond the Pantheon, one could just make out Palatine Hill, with the gargantuan Colosseum on one side and the Circus Maximus on the other. And still further in that exact same direction, from the gates of entry for Castel Sant'Angelo, was the Lateran Hill. Now, the Lateran Hill, it should be noted, was the primary residence of every single bishop of Rome during the Middle Ages, from Emperor Constantine, who gifted the entire hill to the church, to Pope Nicholas V in the mid-1400s, who was the first pope to move the papal residence to the Vatican, where it still remains today. So during the papacy of Gregory VII, he lived on the Lateran Hill in what was and is still today called the Lateran Palace. That's where the business of the papacy was conducted for medieval popes. The Lateran Palace was another 15 minutes beyond even the Palatine Hill. It's mind-boggling to think of the history in which Pope Gregory VII lived and worked. Walking from Castel Sant'Angelo southeast toward his residence on the Lateran Hill, Gregory would have spent about 1 hour walking as the crow flies. He would have walked across an 800-year-old bridge, also built by Emperor Hadrian, the 492-foot-long, 23-foot-wide Pont Sant'Angelo, which crosses the Tiber River. From there, he would have walked through or by the 1st century AD Piazza Navona, the Pantheon, Trajan's Column, Trajan's Forum, Augustus's Forum, the Temple of Jupiter, the ancient Mamertine Prison, the Arch of Constantine, the Colosseum, the famous Baths of Trajan, and even an ancient villa owned by one of Trajan's advisors that Gregory himself most likely knew nothing about because it wasn't officially discovered until the 1960s. There's just so much history embedded in the history of our history. Within a century or two of King Odoacer collapsing the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, Hadrian's mausoleum was converted into a fortress right there in the middle of Rome. And it served as such well into the 11th century, which is why Pope Gregory VII sought refuge there a few times during his papacy. Certainly in the year 1083, where our current narrative is, that's where he was. Throughout the centuries, it received renovation after renovation, adding walls, expanding its surrounding defensive perimeters, these all coming together to give its unique star-shaped quality it has today. And that it had in Pope Gregory VII's time. However, in the 500s AD, while the Romans were suffering under one of its many pandemics that would make COVID look like the sniffles, this plague was called the Justinian Plague and was one of the most devastating in recorded history, certainly to that point in history. Interestingly, the Justinian Plague between 541 and 544, with aftershocks occurring as late as the 700s, mind you, was actually called the first, get this, the first bubonic plague. We'll flesh this out in much more detail later in the 1300s for obvious reasons. But the second bubonic plague is what we call the Black Death. The third bubonic plague, interestingly enough, was in southeastern Asia at the turn of the 20th century. Let's pray there's no fourth, okay? Now, as for the Justinian Plague, the first bubonic plague, upwards of 25 to 50 million souls were taken from the Mediterranean region, from Iberia to Rome. This, of course, plunged medieval Europe further down into the so-called Dark Ages. Anyway, during the Justinian Plague in Rome, Castel Sant'Angelo fortress became a bit of a safe haven for folks seeking safety from Yersinia pestis, the name of the bubonic plague origin. It was during this time, as understandably in any other horrific time in history, that the people of Rome sought out aid and mercy from their God more than ever. One incarnation of this desperation came in the form of the removal of the giant sculpture of Emperor Hadrian that still reigned supreme at its highest peak, that is, on top of Castel Sant'Angelo. Now, decades after the main epidemic of bubonic plague, as it swept across Rome, decades after, in the year 589, another devastating wave and aftershock swept through the city, and it took the lives of tens of thousands more people, including Pope Pelagio II. Now, Gregory I became pope during this particular pandemic, just 1 year later in 590. Rome was in absolute dire straits. On August 29th, 590, in a Hail Mary, no pun intended, Pope Gregory I ordered the people of Rome to pray like they've never prayed before. According to the website milestonerome.com, quote, he then ordered for the 3 following days a solemn procession with the ancient icon depicting the Virgin Mary with child from the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore. End quote. During one of these processions, as he led a large crowd of devotees across the Pont Sant'Angelo, the bridge, according to the website, quote, Gregorio beheld together with the other participants the Archangel Michael, standing atop the mausoleum of Hadrian, in the act of wiping a flaming sword and returning it to its sheath. End quote. That's just an awesome view. Now, from this, Pope Gregory I took this to mean that the plague would be coming to an end soon. In honor of the heavenly defender's appearance, Gregory ordered a statue of Michael the Archangel be sculpted and placed where Hadrian's statue once stood. Between the late 590s and 1753, Gregory's statue of the Archangel stood tall, marking Castel Sant'Angelo a safe haven for anyone seeking God's aid and mercy. Side note, there is still a statue of the Archangel Michael above Castel Sant'Angelo, but it was carved by Peter Anton von Verschaffelt, standing a staggering 18 feet tall. Pope Gregory I, or what he would be known as in the future, Pope Gregory the Great, would lead Rome and the Latin West for another decade almost, and he would become known as the Pope who led the Church out of its classical age and into its medieval one, an age climaxing with Pope Gregory VII as the ecclesiastical ruler who was not afraid of being a secular one as well. As a fun fact, the Castel Sant'Angelo didn't receive that name right away, right after Pope Gregory the Great's angelic vision. No, in fact, it was still called Hadrian's Mausoleum until well into the 900s AD. But after almost 4 centuries of Gregorio's legend percolated in the hearts and minds of the Roman people, it finally came to the fore as a place of great reverence, and thus it received its current name of Castel Sant'Angelo during that century. Castel Sant'Angelo, by the way, translates to Castle of the Holy Angel. Castel Sant'Angelo was a place of reverence and history for centuries of Romans, both pre-Christian and Christian. But with Gregory the Great's vision, it became a safe haven for all in desperate need of God's mercy and assistance. Castel Sant'Angelo has been at the heart of numerous historical moments, being a critical place of safety for nobles and popes alike during moments of intense political and military strife. Here's a short list of them. In 752, while awaiting King Pepin the Short, Charlemagne's father, by the way, to relieve Rome of the invading Lombards, Pope Stephen II tucked himself away behind Castel Sant'Angelo's stout walls. Just 47 years later, in 799, Roman nobles sought to blind and mutilate Pope Leo III, but he was able to escape to Castel Sant'Angelo before narrowly sneaking out of the Eternal City in order to meet up with Charlemagne. Had Leo III not had access to Castel Sant'Angelo, which bought him time to devise a plan of escape, 1 year later, in the year 800, Charlemagne would never have become the first Holy Roman Emperor. I beg the question, would there ever even have been a Holy Roman Empire? Next, due to Pope John XIII's close ties with Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, Otto the Great, in the year 965, Roman nobles tried to kill him, but Castel Sant'Angelo bought him the time necessary for Otto to come to his rescue. It wasn't always a safe haven, however. Just 9 years later, in 974, Pope Benedict VI was imprisoned there by Roman aristocrats who were desperate to once and for all break the ties between Pope and German king. Seems to be a pattern, huh? Unfortunately for Benedict, though, there was a violent coup in the city, and he was strangled to death in his prison of Castel Sant'Angelo. In 998, the powerful Crescenti family in Rome, led by Crescentius II, led another coup against the German-backed pope. Their choice for pope, known as Antipope John XVI, held out there at Castel Sant'Angelo, but in the end he was blinded and disposed of. Crescentius II continued his rebellion against Otto III for another 3 years, only to find himself also seeking refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo. In the year 1001, Crescentius was executed, allowing for the future Pope Gregory VII's family to rise to the highest echelons of Roman power. And this, at last, brings us full circle. Directly above Pope Gregory VII, in the year 1083, at the peak of the Castel Sant'Angelo, was the statue of the Archangel Michael, once again protecting any person who sought his assistance against those who might attack the church itself, which is certainly the opinion of Gregory VII and all those who opposed Henry IV and his antipope Clement III. It was as if Gregory truly believed his predecessor had set that statue there for him, surely, because Gregory VII, though still in a very precarious situation, must have felt safe enough there to flee to, and not out of the city and into the arms of Robert Guiscard down in Salerno. Gregory was still allowed to somehow get letters out to his benefactors and supporters, but none of them, including high-ranking church officials such as Archbishop of Lyon and the Bishop of Como and Lucca, were able to gain entry to Castel Sant'Angelo. Henry had him perfectly surrounded, and he could write all the letters he wanted. The Pope's situation wasn't going to change anytime soon. This freed the German king to head back up into Tuscany to try to suffocate Countess Matilda even more than she already was. At the same time, though desperate for a change in his fortunes, Gregory was also perfectly safe where he was. Sure, he had walls within walls within walls, but he had Michael the Archangel watching over him and his enemies, literally. As John Julius Norwich writes in his book, The Other Conquest, quote, "A few months more discomfort, and even a little more humiliation, would do him no harm." End quote. In November of 1083, an already scheduled synod was held in Rome, and Henry swore to allow Gregory visitors. But he quickly reneged on that the moment the synod ended. Norwich adds a little too cheekily, quote, "Henry never allowed his promises to interfere with his policies." End quote. The most notable thing to happen from this isn't people being denied entry to Castel Sant'Angelo, but the Bishop of Ostia, Cardinal Odo, was actually imprisoned. About this Cardinal Bishop Odo of Ostia, well, he was appointed Bishop of Ostia by Gregory VII himself. He had been the abbot of the powerhouse monastery Cluny prior to this. And before that, he was born Odo of Châtillon-sur-Marne, along the path between Paris and Rheims in northern France. But who was he before 1083, before he was imprisoned for trying to see Pope Gregory VII? Well, that's not the point I was trying to make. In fact, the point I want to make is who Bishop Odo of Ostia would become. Henry IV had just imprisoned the future Pope Urban II. Yes, the very same Pope who called upon all Christians Europe to embark on a crusade to recapture Jerusalem. Well done there, Henry. Not a good look for a German king who had unknowingly created yet another papal enemy, who would give him hell for years after the death of the king's current papal nemesis. Well done. Over the winter of 1083 to 1084, Henry IV would return to Rome and wait on the old pope to just surrender already. He should have known who he was dealing with after all these years. There are few forces in politics as sturdy as Pope Gregory VII, even if he was the one in the weakest possible position from which to negotiate. And negotiations were the thing Henry was desperately trying to hold with Gregory that winter. Message after message was sent over that wall, but each one was returned with Gregory mooning King Henry out of one of the highest windows in the central drum of the citadel. I wish that were true, but the sentiment is still accurate. Gregory wasn't having any of it. But was it simply Gregory's surrender that Henry was after? If the Pope did surrender, Henry would certainly renege on any promise of safe conduct because, well, that's just the way Henry was. And if you think it would be anything less, then I'm sorry, you just haven't been listening very closely. Remember who Pope Gregory VII was to Henry. There was genuine hatred there. Hatred that went both ways. So, Gregory surrenders, and the best outcome is that he spends the rest of his life in prison. Beyond that, Henry gets his choice of pope in Rome, and with no contender, Clement III would be that person. The question is, though, for what end? What was Henry's endgame? What's the same endgame he's had since he became king as a boy? Since he watched his father walk around in his imperial crown, and as not King Henry III, but rather as Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. Henry IV wanted that crown. He wanted that title. And there were two people who would have been in his way throughout his entire reign as Germany's king. Countess Matilda had already been dealt with. There was only Gregory left, and Gregory wasn't given in. Henry had done everything he could, but I find it quite interesting, even poetic, that he could push his enemies back. He could surround them. He could suffocate their resources and imprison their enemies, but he couldn't actually get to them. Both Matilda and Gregory were in safe and sound places in their respective citadels. Citadels that Henry just simply couldn't breach. And yet, even in their situations, Henry, who by all accounts was on top of the entire situation, was still unable to accomplish his ultimate goals merely because these people were holding out. The fact that they existed was enough to keep Henry from what he'd longed for as long as he can remember. Which is why negotiations with Gregory were happening. Henry must have Gregory give in. Otherwise, the man's mere presence on this mortal coil was enough to keep him from what he desired most. And Henry and his people became more and more desperate, too, as the winter progressed. Norwich adds, quote, "A ludicrous suggestion by some of the Roman nobles for the compromise, by which Gregory would not actually perform Henry's coronation, but would pass him down the imperial diadem on a stick from the battlements of Sant'Angelo, met with the contempt it deserved. The stalemate continued." End quote. I'd like to think that Gregory was just being a troll, holding out for as long as he could just to be a thorn in Henry's side for as long as possible. But I don't think that's the real reason for him holding out. He was waiting on help. The aid promised by Archangel Michael by way of his namesake and predecessor, Pope Gregory I, so many centuries before. History was echoing back to him, and he firmly believed that Michael the Archangel would protect him, as he had protected God's children throughout human history. Unfortunately, as Gregory knew more than most about being the right-hand man here on earth for big guns upstairs, the plans of the heavenly host are mysteries to us mere mortals. As Norwich writes, quote-unquote, "And still Robert Guiscard failed to appear." Gregory believed Guiscard would arrive, but he had no idea when that might be. But his faith kept his chin up. But when will Guiscard show up? Will Guiscard even show up at all? We'll find out next time. The spring of 1084 is fast approaching, and we have a desperate king becoming more and more desperate. Henry was not the type of man you wanted to become too desperate. What's more is that as the winter moved along, rumors were verified. The Romans themselves were behind Henry's easy access to the city, or at least the parts of the city he now controlled. Okay, we knew that, but it goes deeper than that. There was something else that happened that helped nudge the city's surrender along. This was a major blow to both Gregory as well as Robert Guiscard when he learned of it that winter. Well, it seems that it wasn't merely a matter of the Roman populace being simply exhausted from the city constantly being in someone's crosshairs. Digging deeper, we find that there was some Byzantine gold thrown the Romans' way. Once again, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos of Eastern Rome and his prolific letter-writing campaign to any and all who would accept his money undermined his enemies' efforts. Henry had returned to Rome, and Rome had folded because of Alexios Komnenos. Even with his back up against the wall, Alexios Komnenos was still able to shift the balances of power as far off and as foreign as the Italian peninsula. Thanks for listening. Until next time.